Good morning, First Christian. Thank you for joining us for our morning Sunday school class. And we're going to be in the book of 2 Kings. We're going to be in chapter 8. We've been talking about Elisha the prophet and some of the miracles that he's been doing. And our overall look at the book of 1st and 2nd Kings has been revolving around this idea of the relationship between the Word of God to the king. And so we're going to continue on in chapter 8. Let's go ahead and read chapter 8, verses 1 through 6.
Now Elisha said to the woman, whose son he had restored to life, Arise and depart with your household, and sojourn wherever you can. For the Lord has called for a famine, and it will come upon the land for 7 years. So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. She went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, when the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, she went to appeal to the king for her house and her land. Now the king was talking with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me all the great things that Elisha has done. And while he was telling the king how Elisha had restored the dead to life, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life appeared to the king for her house and her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, here is the woman, and here is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed an official for her, saying, Restore all that was hers, together with all the produce of the fields from the day that she left the land until now.
All right, so we're talking about the Shunammite woman. Now, we've seen her previously, and when we saw her already, she's a woman who's had lots of problems, and she was able to have a son, and he died, and he was restored to life, and all that stuff happened. And at the time, I don't know if any of you recall, but what is it that we said about the relation? There's always a cast of characters in any Bible story, and they're always symbolic. Now, they're obviously who they are as a person, but they also symbolize something a little bit more universal. So when a woman comes into the story, what should we immediately think of? Who does the woman stand for? What does she represent? Okay, it could be Eve.
Mother? Are you
Okay.
looking for something like a specific person?
What's that?
The nation.
The nation. Okay, yeah. So
The bride of Christ.
right. So the woman is the bride, and as the bride, she represents at the highest order. She represents the people of God. Okay. So remember that everything from the biblical perspective, you have these universal characters, and then everything else is a microcosm. So the family is the microcosm of the kingdom, as an example. But from the highest order, you have a woman is the people of God. From the next rung down, she represents the nation. The next rung down from that, she represents a bride in the family, right? So at every level, the woman is always going to be symbolic of that. So when you have a situation where a woman comes into the story, you're always going to have this idea that she's going to represent something bigger than herself in these stories. Because think about it this way. From the book of 1 Kings to the book of 2 Kings, how many kings have we dealt with here? Do you guys have... It's been many, right? Right, yeah, 20 or 30 kings. That's a lot of time, right? So out of all of that time, why are they putting these specific stories in the Bible and leaving so many other things out, right? I mean, you're talking about, this is like the history of the United States, but it's shrunk down into something that's really, really small, right? So if you look at a history book, let's say you find out from genealogy.com that you have some relative that fought in the Civil War. And so you go into your Civil War history book and you read through and you read through and you read through and you don't find any mention of them. Why not?
Probably didn't do anything significant.
Right. They have to do something that has meaning or importance on a higher level in order for them to get into the book. In the Bible, it's the same thing. There's a reason why these are the stories that have been curated down into what we have here. There's a reason why, the writers under inspiration included some stories but not other stories. I actually have a cousin that was involved in the initial invasion of Iraq in 2003, and I was reading this book called Thunder Run, And as I'm reading through, lo and behold, I come across my cousin. Now, the reason that my cousin was in the book was unfortunately because his was the only tank that got hit when they were doing the Thunder Run. So out of all the tanks, his was the only, well, not the only one hit, the only one disabled. His tank was disabled. It kept catching on fire, and they kept trying to put it out. And finally, they decided it was too dangerous to stay there any longer, and so they blew the tank up and left. But something significant happened that he was involved in. If he was just one of the regular guys in this long line of vehicles, then you wouldn't have heard anything about him. So the thing is that when we come across these stories, the woman is always representative of something. And so as the people of God, what is symbolic about her? What's significant about her as she represents all of God's people? So what do we see? What's going on here? There's a famine in the land, and she's told, hey, you probably should go out somewhere else. And she goes out, and how long does she stay out?
7 years.
7 years. Okay, so 7 years she stays out, and then when she comes back, she comes before the king, and the king says, what?
Give back to her everything that was.
Right.
Return to her.
Return to her land. So, from the standpoint of the people of God, what's significant about this? What does this represent?
The reception of the promised land.
Okay, so the reception of the promised land, and when you have to leave your land, what is that called?
Oh, exile.
Exile, right? So she's
Restoration.
doing an exile and then coming back, and the king is then restoring to her what is hers. And so she's actually representative of the whole nation and what's going to happen to the whole nation. The whole nation's going to get exiled, and then the whole nation's going to come back in. And we talked about that last week with the idea of Jesus and Jesus coming into the land. Remember, Jesus gets baptized when he goes into, when he starts his ministry. And Jesus is baptized where? In the Jordan, right? And what it represents is it represents a coming back into the land, because you had to cross the Jordan to get into the promised land. And so originally Israel goes and they cross the Jordan to get into the promised land, and that represents, like Eden, it represents the place that is the habitable order that God creates. And they go across the Jordan into it, and then when Jesus comes, remember, John the Baptist is baptizing, and he's baptizing people in the Jordan, and he's out in the wilderness. It says he's out in the wilderness baptizing people in the Jordan. Well, what is he representing? Well, you have to go through the wilderness, and then you cross the Jordan, and then you get into the promised land. And what he's showing, what John the Baptist is showing, is that it's not about physical location, right? Just because you live in Jerusalem physically doesn't mean that you live in Jerusalem spiritually, right? If your life, if your mind, if your existence isn't ordered by God, then you're not really living in the promised land. And so he has them leave Jerusalem, go out into the wilderness, and reenact this going back, because the idea is you have to re-enter the land. You have to reestablish a covenant relationship with God where you're ordered by what God wants, and then you can go in and you can start living in the promised land again. Well, what happens is that Jesus comes in, and Jesus is baptized because he's entering into the promised land, and he's like a new Adam being placed in the garden, and he's reestablishing the kingdom. And so everything that Jesus does through his ministry is reestablishing the kingdom. Well, you have a similar thing going on here, that this woman, she's been in exile because of a famine, and she goes across back to her land, and her land then is restored by the king. Okay, if she represents the people of God, who does the king represent? He represents God, right? God's saying, okay, I'm going to restore your land, and that was always God's desire, is to bring his people back from exile and to restore their land. Now, when we're talking about restoring the land and all the crops, remember we talked last week about the idea of feasting, right? So what does it mean to feast? To party, yes, it's a festival, it's a party.
Celebrate.
To celebrate, yeah. And we talked about how Every time that God tells his people to come and meet with him, he institutes a feast because that's what it is. So when you meet with God, it's always a feast. Now, there's only one exception to that. That's the Day of Atonement. And the reason that's the exception is because that's the time when the atoning sacrifice has to leave the presence of God. That's why there's a fast on that day, right? Because fasting is being away from the presence of God. Feasting is being in the presence of God. Okay? And so in the Bible, whenever you see people in the Old Testament fasting, it was because they're acknowledging their distance from God. So a lot of times they would fast and they would have sackcloth and ashes, and they're acknowledging their distance from God. You're acknowledging that I'm away from God. Now, one of the things that you would do in the New Testament, how you see fasting used, is if they have a big decision to make. And I think, once again, it's a representation of the idea that without God, you can't make a proper decision. So it's symbolic of the need for the presence of God. You acknowledge your need for him, and so then you call on him to make the decision. But the idea here is that whenever you're with God, you have fasting, right? And when we talked about this, feasting.
Yeah.
Yes. As I said it, I thought, where did that sound come
One
from?
letter is all it takes.
Right, so you have God, you have the people, and then you have the land. And God glorifies the people, and then the people glorify the land by making it fruitful. And so when you have these three things together, you have a feast. You have celebration, you have a party, you have plenty, you have fruitfulness, you have joy, right? That's the idea. So whenever you have a situation where there's a famine, you have the opposite of that. God is away from the people, so the people aren't glorified, so therefore the land's not glorified, so then you have big problems. So what's happening is she's coming back in and everything's being restored to her. Now, here's the thing that's really interesting about that, is we're right on the cusp of a lot of bad things happening, okay? So, if we turn over to 2 Kings chapter 9. So, Jehu gets anointed king of Israel. Jehu assassinates Joram and Ahaziah. And Jehu executes Jezebel. All kinds of things are going to happen. And there's like the thing that's been prophesied for a long time. Because you remember Jehu and all these guys have been, they were first talked about at the end of Elijah's reign, Elijah's ministry, back at the end of 1 Kings. So 1 Kings happens. Remember, Elijah's really, really down in the dumps. Remember, he has that big showdown with the prophets of Baal, and he's victorious over them. But in the end, it doesn't matter because Jezebel's still on the throne, and she's chasing him. And you remember, he was like super, super depressed. And God says to him, hey, it's okay because I'm going to have you anoint this guy king of was it not Samaria, but the other place. And then I'm going to have you anoint Jehu, king of Israel, and I'm going to have you, and you're going to anoint Elisha. So there's three guys that he's going to anoint, right? Syria. So the other king was the king of Syria. Okay, so Syria, and then Israel or Samaria, and then another prophet. I'm going to have you anoint all these guys, and they're going to bring judgment upon the house of Ahab. That was the big prophecy. But that happened like 10 chapters ago. Okay, it was a long time ago that happened. And now all of a sudden, in chapter 9, what you have is this finally actually takes place. So all the things that God had prophesied are finally going to start happening. They start happening here in chapter 8, starting in verse, we can even say starting in verse 7 is where this starts getting set up. And that goes through chapter 8, verse 16. It goes through chapter 8, 25. And then it really gets going in chapter 9. So all of the things that God prophesied are just starting to take place. Now, here's the thing that we have to understand here. What is the king that we're dealing with in this story in 2 Kings chapter 8? When the Shunammite land is restored, who's restoring her land? Right. Jehoram. There you go. Thank you. I just found it. Yeah, I just found it right here, Jehoram. So here's the thing. There's a guy named Jehoram, and then there's a guy named Jehoash, and then there's a guy named Josiah, and all of them are going to be in the mix here in this story. So here's the thing. Jehoram is the guy who's king at this point. Oh, there we go. And in fact, it says in the 5th year of, this is Joram. So there's also Joram. There's Jehoram and Joram and Josiah and Jehoash. And Jehoshaphat, thank you. One of the reasons that all these guys' names become very similar is because they end up being related to each other. So this is both kings that are in the northern kingdom of Israel and in the southern kingdom of Judah. So what happens is that there starts to be intermarriage between the royal dynasties of these two nations. And so you'll end up with there's some kings that will be in Judah that will have exactly the same names as kings in Israel. And so it starts to get really, really confusing. Okay, so here we have Jehoram, and Jehoram is actually doing something right, okay? He's actually taking this woman and he's giving her he's giving her justice. And this hasn't happened actually since the time of Solomon. So the last time we had a story of a king giving a woman justice was the time of Solomon. Now, from the standpoint of the king, if there's a woman in the story, and the story is a woman and a king, we can say it's representative of God and the people of God. We could also say on the next level down, it's a story about the king and his people. This one woman will represent the people of the king. And so this is really the first time that we have a story of a woman who's receiving justice, of a people who are receiving justice from their king. Now, so this seems like things are going well, and yet what happens is just the very next story, the end of his reign and his line starts to unfold. And the question that we want to ask is, you had Ahab, who was a terrible, terrible king, and then you have Jehoram, who's a bad king, but is way, way better than his dad. And yet it's in Jehoram's reign that the end begins, right? And so what we want to think about is, why would God work it that way? Why would God create a situation where the guy who's super evil, nothing bad happens to him, but the guy who actually starts to do some things right, that's when everything falls apart? And the reason that we want to ask this is because there's actually a pattern here. So a good example is look at the Soviet Union. Was Stalin a terrible guy? Oh, he was just awful. Stalin was just awful. Was Lenin a terrible guy? Oh, just as bad as you can get, right? Was Gorbachev a terrible guy? Not nearly as bad as the other ones. Yet, when does the Soviet Union, the USSR, when does it fall apart? During Gorbachev's time, right? So the question is, there's actually a pattern here that you can see in a lot of different nations. Why is it that God has a tendency to bring the judgment on the guys that weren't as bad as their predecessors? It's a tough question because it doesn't seem to make any sense, but this pattern happens so often in history that it bears looking at, and it's certainly happening right now in this section that we're reading. So any ideas why this might happen? Okay. There's probably something to that.
It's always going to be messy to try and clean something up.
Okay, yeah, you start cleaning up the mess and all of a sudden you realize how bad things are. There's definitely something there. One of the things to think about, there's a lot of different aspects of this, and we'll cover a couple of them, but one of the things to think about is there's always a delay between the planting of the seed, so here we have our ground and here's our seed, and then we have the watering of the seed, and then we have the thing sprouting up, and then finally we have the thing bearing fruit. Okay, and the fruit will be a flower. There's our pretty flower. Okay. So, this is the stage of growth, right? Is you first have to plant the seed, and then you have to water it, and then it sprouts up, and usually there's some weeding and things to do, and then there's finally fruitfulness. And the problem is that as human beings, we have a tendency to see these as separate, distinct things instead of all part of this inevitable cycle. Meaning this, once the seed is planted, there's kind of an inevitability of this cycle. Meaning, and I don't mean that it's inevitable that once the seed's planted, you're going to have fruit. What I mean is that we have a tendency to see these as separate, distinct things rather than parts of a whole. Okay, we tend to believe that if I plant the seed, then I can do that without the fruit being born. And what we mean by that is that how many times have you, maybe in your own life or maybe in other people's lives, seen somebody who's older, who's at a point where something in their life is just a really big mess? I mean, it's like a disaster. And you think to yourself, well, how did it get like that? And you realize that at some point in the past, this thing that's a disaster was actually not that big of a deal, and it could have been solved really easily back then, but it wasn't. And it was allowed to grow, and it was allowed to grow, and it was allowed to grow. And it can be any kind of things. It can be a bad attitude that leads to bitterness. It can be like a spending problem. It can be, a problem with eating. It can be a problem, there's like almost anything in our lives, right? If it's not, and the problem is that when you were young, you didn't equate the planting of that seed, the starting of that habit, you didn't equate that with the way things would be when you became older. You guys know what I'm saying? And this is one of those things that is all over the place. And when you open your eyes to it, you start to see how prevalent this pattern is. In the same way, there's the delay, and if you plant a good habit, there's a delay in receiving the fruit. Right? So, and maybe the easiest way to see this is with children going to school, right? They go to kindergarten, they go to first grade, and, they're like spending all this time in class, and then finally they're like sixth graders, and then, hopefully they go on and they're in junior high, and then they're in high school, and still there's not like a lot of fruit. Like, you graduate from high school and you can get an entry-level job, but that's it. And then maybe they go to college, and then maybe they get their master's degree, and then they get their PhD. You know what I'm saying? And finally, after all that time, they can walk into some place in a really high-end job, like maybe making like really, really good money. Just walk straight from there, from preparation into doing the job. But how many people in that process, not seeing the fruit, leave the process, right? Because they go, why am I going to keep doing this? Why should I keep doing this? Right? So the problem that we have, and this is always the case, is that in the Old Testament, and we covered this last week also, the idea of putting God to the test is the idea of saying, okay, God, I did what you wanted. Where's the reward? And the reason that that's considered such a sinful thing is because of this idea that all these things take time to reach maturity. All these things take time to get to the point where they're really bearing the fruit, so where everyone can see the difference. When you go into a doctor's office, or even somebody introduces their son or daughter and they're a doctor, everybody goes, oh, they're a doctor, right? Because that's, at that point, it's obvious to everybody that that's a good thing. But when somebody introduces, oh, this is my son, he's in sixth grade, you don't go, oh, wow, I'm impressed, right? Because you don't connect those things yet. And so the problem is that we have a tendency not to understand these things. So a lot of people will look at this and say, well, Jehoram isn't that bad a guy. God is not being good. But what you have to understand is it really, at this point, it doesn't matter, to a large extent, it doesn't matter how good a guy Jehoram is. that there's a process that was started with Ahab, and God said, hey, Ahab, your descendants are going to get, messed up over what you've done. And Ahab's probably like, but there was a process started that's now starting to bear fruit. And that's the nature of it. Now, there's certain times when somebody can be so good that they can turn that around. But you have to be, at that point, you have to be really, really good. It's kind of like this, if the plane is flying straight and level and the pilot dies, you don't have to be that great to come into the cockpit to listen to, because now planes, most of those big jetliners have auto landing features where you could flip some switches and some buttons and the air traffic controllers could talk you in through that and the plane would land itself. But if you're in a nosedive, right, and you're minutes or maybe even seconds away from hitting the ground, well, then you better be a really good pilot if you're going to take the controls. And that's the situation, is that Jehoram's a better guy than his predecessors, but he's not a good enough guy the country's crashing and he is not equipped to pull them out of that. And so it doesn't matter that he's a little bit better than the others. Now, when you start to think about this, it's important then, hopefully in our thinking, what we do is go, hey, I should probably, once I recognize that I'm heading in a bad direction, start pulling up, because I should probably not assume that I have the skill to wait until the last second to pull it up. I was watching this air race, and have you ever seen those air races where they, like Red Bull puts them on and they're flying over a river? I think this one was like over the Thames or whatever it's, in London. And they're flying around these different pylons, and they have to do it in a certain amount of time. And this guy went down, and I don't know what happened, but he just dropped, and his wing actually hit the water. And it hit the water like twice, boom, boom. And yet he was able to gain control and fly that back. He was an outstanding pilot, but we shouldn't all assume that we could do that, right?
Nobody else could.
Right, and so that's the issue here, is that there's a lot of bad things coming, and these bad things are because there's a lot of fruit that's been planted and that has to come out. Now, the other thing that we should understand is a lot of times what you get is you get a little bit of an upturn towards the end because God's actually preparing what's going to come next. And what I mean by that is this, is that God will always create the next kingdom out of the plunder of the old kingdom. So we can look at a lot of Israel's history and see this. When Israel was out in the middle of the wilderness and God called them to build a tabernacle, what did they build it out of? They were slaves, right? How do they have gold and silver and bronze and jewels? How do they have all that?
Yeah, all the Egyptians gave them the stuff.
Yeah, they plundered it from the Egyptians. So the ruins of the old kingdom, and usually it's kind of the stump that's left out of the old kingdom becomes the new kingdom. And we can see this quite a bit. Let's look at Matthew chapter 9, verse 17. And Jesus will say something here that's kind of sets up the whole idea of this pattern.
Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved.
Okay, so you don't put new wine in old wineskins. Okay, why is that?
Once a new wine ferments, the old skins can't give.
Right, so the old wineskin has been stretched as far as it can. And so if you put new wine into that, it's going to ferment, it's going to expand, and that wineskin can't hold it. So one of the things that Jesus is talking about here is that there's a difference between the spirit of something and the physical manifestation of that. And like you can think about it this way. If I say to you, what is America? What do you say?
Land of the free and the home of the brave.
Land of the free and the home of the brave. So I notice you didn't give me like a latitude and longitude, right, of the borders
I
or.
wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay. But so the thing is, if we can say, well, what is America? And there's a lot of different levels we can answer that at, right? We can answer it as, it's the people who live within this geographical boundary. We can say it's, the government. The government represents the people, right? So we could say the U.S. government. There's a lot of things that we can say. We can also say there's a spirit of America, and that's what you're getting at, right? There's a spirit of patriotism. There's a spirit of freedom. There's a spirit of ingenuity. There's a spirit of kind of risk taking. Those things are America. Now let's say this. Let's say that we decide that we don't like the spirit of America anymore, and we're going to change that spirit. And so we're going to turn America into the spirit of binge watching Netflix and eating Pepperidge Farms cookies.
It's no longer America then.
Okay, well, yeah, it's no longer America. So we've changed the spirit of that. Now, here's the thing. Can you change the spirit of America and have all of the other levels and understanding of America stay the same? Meaning, can the government stay the same? Can the institutions stay the same? Can all of these things stay the same if we change the spirit of America?
Not a chance.
No, it's going to morph into something else.
Right. So you can't, and that's the idea, is you can't put new wine into the old wineskin. You can't take a new spirit and put it into an old manifestation, whether that's a physical body. And that's why, people, I remember a kid asking me when I was going through the baptism stuff with him, and he said, and I said, so when you die, you'll go to heaven. And he's like, wait, I'll still die? Like, in his mind, if he got baptized, he wouldn't have to die. And he didn't understand why that would be the case. Why do I still have to die? Well, you're having a new spirit put in you, and that means that you're going to need a new manifestation of that. You're going to need a new body. And so, the new spirit can grow in you for a while, but eventually that's not going to work anymore. You have to have a new body to go with it. And that's always the case. It's always the case that whenever you change the spirit, eventually you have to change the manifestation. You have to change the body, whether that's institutions, whether it's whatever. And so the interesting thing is we can see that from the standpoint of changing something for good or changing it for ill. Right? You can come and say, we're going to reform this thing and we're going to make it better. And maybe you will, but what's going to happen along the way is you'll reach a point where that change, even if it's for the good, will mean that the old manifestation will have to collapse in order for something new that fits around it. You can see that with churches, congregations, you can see that with clubs, you can see that with families, you can see that with all kinds of things. Here's the thing. Try this. If you've ever had experience with a family that's kind of dysfunctional, try getting your life together and then still maintaining the same relationships you had with your family.
Not easy.
It's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah, it can't be.
It really is absolutely impossible to do that. Why?
Like ripples in a pond. When one
Yeah.
thing changes, everything's affected.
Because there's a new spirit there, and the manifestation of that is going to have to change. And so that's why generally people don't change, is because people want to stay in the situation that they have. Now, one of the things that we see here happening is that there's some changes going on in the nation of Israel, and that's going to keep going on, but the actual nation, the physical manifestation is going to have to be destroyed. It's going to have to fall away, and then it's going to have to rise again. And the whole idea of resurrection, of death and resurrection, is really the idea of the spirit being transformed and the body having to die and be replaced in order to match that. Okay, so here's the thing. Like, when this happens in nations all the time. Okay, nations die and are reborn all the time. And sometimes they die and they're reborn in a new way and in a better way, and sometimes they die and are reborn in a worse way. But nations go through this periodically. So when would you guys say was the last time America went through a major rebirth?
Recently.
Okay, I think we're probably going through one right now. But before that, it was probably, like the 60s? There was a lot of convulsion and things going on. This is the nature of things, and we don't know yet what the physical manifestation is going to be. But one of the mistakes that people make is they look at the physical manifestation and they see the old physical manifestation dying, and they put all their efforts into reviving that, and they don't understand that the real driver behind that is that the spirit of the thing has changed, and that is, your efforts would be better placed addressing the spirit of the thing, because you can't save the physical thing. If you work on creating a better spirit, then what gets reborn will be better, and you'll actually move forward. Things can actually be better than they are now if you address the spirit. But if you actually try to just address the body and keep the body alive, and you neglect the spirit, well, then there's going to be a bad spirit there, and then what's reborn is going to be worse than it was before. And people make that mistake all the time, like all the time. And I think you see it happening now, where there's a lot of people that are really focused on political things, and they don't understand that political thing, that's a physical manifestation. The spiritual thing is the culture and the religion, and if you don't focus on those two things, it doesn't matter. You're going to put all your efforts into reviving the corpse, and you can't do that. Things die. That's the way that it works. And so let's look at a couple of examples of this. I think that when you look at Revelation, you actually see a picture of this process happening. So Revelation chapter 5, verse 1 through 5.
Then I saw in the right hand of him who was seated on the throne a scroll written within and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep loudly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, "Weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so he can open the scroll and its 7 seals."
Okay, so we have this situation up in heaven. So if you read the book of Revelation, you get this description at the beginning of heaven. And the problem with this heaven description, it looks a lot like the Old Testament tabernacle or temple, except for there's no table of showbread in it. And that means there's no people, there's no human beings in it. Now you have the elders who are sitting there and they're casting their crowns down, but I think that those elders should be thought of more as angelic or spiritual elders, a spiritual council. And I think the idea of them casting their crowns is that they're making way for human beings to come in and be in the temple. But there's no people in the temple at the beginning of the book of Revelation. And so there's this great problem, and the great problem is that we need to find out who's able to read this scroll or open this scroll. And the way to think of the scroll here is that it's a book of judgment. That we need to open up the book of judgment. And really what's happening, to give you guys a whole bunch of stuff condensed really quickly, is you have in the book of Revelation, you have the old world, the old covenant, the old creation being judged. So here we have our old creation, our old covenant, our Old Testament. That whole old creation is being judged, and there's a new creation that's going to be started. But what has to happen is, in order for the new one to start, the old one has to be judged. And you get this problem of, in chapter 6, the very next chapter, you're going to start seeing that all these judgments, all these seals get opened up, and these seals bring judgment. And it's really the old creation that's being judged. And you get this picture of these saints that are underneath the altar, and they're saying, "How long, O Lord, how long?" Right? And he says, "Well, just a little while. Rest a little longer. It's going to be a little bit, but then it's going to happen." Really, I think what's taking place in most of the book of Revelation is that it's really about the transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. And it's about the judgment of the old. And that really kind of culminates in 70 AD. There's a 40-year period between Jesus dying in 30 AD and the temple being destroyed in 70 AD. There's a 40-year period there where there's a transition between the old covenant and the new covenant. And that has to finish And then you have the new covenant that just is going. The old is gone now. And that culminates in the destruction of the temple. You don't need, when the old covenant is done and gone, you don't need a temple anymore. And it still hasn't been rebuilt. Why? Because it's old and done. And you have the new covenant coming. And what is the old, or what's the new covenant made out of? It's made out of the spoils of the old covenant. It's made out of the spoils of the old kingdom, right? It's made out of the apostles who come out of that. It's made out of the reason there's a 40-year transition is because there's a crossover taking place where every time Paul goes into a city, he goes to a synagogue first and he preaches there and says, "Hey, come out of that, come into the new covenant." And then they'll say, we're done with you, but a few people will come. And that's how the new world starts. That's how the new kingdom starts. Okay, when we hire missionaries now, we don't say, "Hey, when you go to that city, make sure if there's a synagogue, make sure and go there first," because that's done with now. Now we're into the new covenant. But the reason that there has to be a new world and the old world has to die and be replaced is because there's a new spirit. That's what is at the heart of the new creation, and then the new creation has to come. So we really shouldn't see this judgment as a bad thing. This judgment is actually a good thing. We want the old world, the old ways, the old problems to be judged and to be gone so that we can embrace the new ways. And you will find that in your life, this same pattern happens all the time. Like, let's say this. Let's say you say, "Well, I want to get healthier. I want to eat right and I want to exercise." There's going to be a transition, right? Where there's the old you fighting with the new you. And at some point, either you'll fall back into the old you, or the old you will be destroyed and the new you will continue. Like it starts in your mind. It starts with the spirit, but then it has to work its way through your life. And
Get along first.
what's that?
You have to get along first.
You have to get along?
The old
Yeah. Well, there's going to be a fight. One of them is going to die. Either the new you that you want to have happen is going to live, and that means the old you is going to die, or the new you that you want to be there is going to be gone because the old you is going to rise up and kill it. That's why the Bible talks about dying to yourself every day, right? It's like putting off the old self. It's crucifying the old self. It's you have to put that you have to kill that, and it's good for that to be judged and killed so that the new life, the new you can live. And if you won't kill the old life, you probably won't enter into the new one. So this concept is really all through creation. It's one of those major themes and patterns of reality. And once you start to understand it, you can actually learn how to change your life a lot better. You'll start to understand why there's this struggle and why you keep wanting to go back and do the old thing. You realize, I've got to kill that. I've got to put it to death so that the new me can be here. And when you do change, eventually you look at the old self and you go, "Wow, I can't believe that I was like that at some point." That's just, I wouldn't even think of doing that now, right? And all of us have changed in some ways that we can look back and we can say, "Wow, that's not even close to who I am." Right? So that's, I think, the idea here. And what we'll see the unfolding of this over the next week or two as we cover the story. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to pray and then we'll be done. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for the blessings you've given. We ask that you'd give us strength to embrace the new life that you have for us. Father, we pray that your Spirit would create in us a new heart so that we might end up having a new life. And we ask, Father, for the courage to put the old life to death. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We'll see you next week.